The concept of a soul is found in many religious traditions, and exploring what a soul might be by researching world traditions is profoundly interesting. In this episode of the podcast, I would like to explore the concept of a soul across religious traditions to answer that burning question: does a soul exist? So we must always be aware of culture when discussing religious concepts, because culture is a powerful part of our worldview and personal identity. For most of us, culture defines the sandbox world in which we live. It is one of the layers of illusion or Maya that prevent us from really understanding higher reality. According to Introduction to Anthropology by Nelson Braff, culture is a set of beliefs, practices, and symbols that are learned and shared. Together, they form an all-encompassing, integrated whole that binds people together and shapes their worldview and life ways. Beliefs are the mental aspects of culture, including values, norms, philosophies, worldviews, knowledge, and so forth. Practices are behaviors and actions that may be motivated by belief or performed without reflection as part of everyday routines. So culture instills within us worldviews and beliefs that lead to practices that define our day-to-day life and are performed without reflection as part of our everyday routines. So a lot of culture is automatic, and we don't really self-reflect on it very well. This kind of gets around to this question: so does a soul exist outside of culture? And this is a fascinating question. It's arguable that human beings are incapable of comprehending life outside of culture. And yet mystical experiences have indicated the existence of higher dimensions of life beyond that which we perceive every day. Buried within this blanket of culture is actually a broad spectrum of consciousness contained within individual bodies, each vibrating at different frequencies, like a diversity of color, a spectrum of sound, creating waves upon waves of perception and causation. So this is why enlightenment or liberation or Gnostic salvation is thought to be absolute freedom from bondage, because this experience exists beyond the bounds of culture. It redefines our sense of self away from the identity given to us by society. The nature of this experience of merging with a higher self, God, or universal consciousness lends itself to a certain unity of spiritual truth that can be perceived around the world if we look beyond simple religious and cultural narrative. So these deeper insights into the nature of consciousness must be valid, because they are replicable across mystical traditions in separate parts of the world. There is subconscious universal symbolism, such as the Tree of Life, and the realizations of these illumined experiences are validated by other scientific fields. For example, modern-day quantum physics is slowly discovering that the teachings of the Vedas have a foundation in reality. By observing how light interacts with the brain under certain sedatives, some researchers now believe that consciousness is indeed quantum in nature. So this makes the possible existence of a soul even more fascinating. So, back to the question of souls. In short, culture is defined by our subsistence pattern, which is our means of gathering food. So you will find predictable patterns on how a religion is organized based on subsistence patterns within a society. The religion of a capitalist culture is going to have some marked distinctions in its definition of a soul that are separate from an agricultural culture or a horticultural culture. And these are predictable patterns that are replicated across the world. Psychology as well is rooted in culture. So we find within the field of psychology certain concepts such as mindfulness, self-esteem, resilience, narcissism, depression, or special mental health disorders, all contained within our American capitalist narrative. So it's difficult to say at this point how much we really know about anything regarding mental health beyond the restrictions of culture, besides that which can be learned through attachment theory. Therefore, take everything people say and do with a grain of salt. Everyone lives under a sort of delusion. Don't feel bad about your own insanity. Our sense of objective reality is really just our culture talking. So Alice in Wonderland is right. We are all mad here. The only truth worth knowing lies within you. And that's why I started this podcast, to help you find it. So when discussing the concept of a soul, we should be careful to consider first what kind of religion we are discussing, and whether the society is capitalist, industrial, agricultural, horticultural, etc. Because you will see this influences our concept of a soul. In Hinduism, we have something like the soul called the Atman. The Atman is a Sanskrit word synonymous with heart because the Atman is known to exist within the heart. But in English Hindu literature, Atman is often translated as self. So Atman, self, and heart are all synonymous with one another. And by heart, this refers to our spiritual heart, which is at the center of the Vedic energy body. And the Atman is bound by this idea of karma, which in simple terms is the cause and effect of every action we take. Good actions lead to good karma, and bad actions lead to bad karma. Eventually, over the course of many lives, our good karma culminates in the purity of the heart, which leads us into liberation. However, through the lens of culture, knowing that religion is an element of culture and culture imbues us with beliefs that lead to practices, we might also point out that for thousands of years, India has operated under a rigid caste system. So this concept of past lives can be seen and understood as a product of the caste system, culture creating the concept of a past life to justify why people should remain in the station they were born into, why the lower classes should remain low class and serve the upper classes, which should remain high above them. And this is justified by karma. And so here we can see that the idea of past lives and karma, though perhaps having some basis of spiritual truth, might also serve to be a facet of culture, which in short is to make us want to do what we have to do. It holds the rules of society together. It explains why society is the way it is and why we must live the way we do. So I find it interesting that in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, who was an enlightened saint in India at the turn of the 20th century, he does not speak of past lives with a great amount of certainty when asked, but instead he defers to his own culture. So when one of his devotees asks him, "Sir, do you believe in the reincarnation of the soul?" Sri Ramakrishna responds, "They say there is something like that. How can we understand the ways of God through our small intellects? Many people have spoken about reincarnation, therefore I cannot disbelieve it." And I find this very interesting. This is a really interesting response to this question, because Ramakrishna remains detached from the concept of reincarnation. He doesn't directly say, yes, 100% reincarnation is true and real. I think the only explanation is that from the perspective of an enlightened being, it might be that some truths are still obscured or just very complicated to explain in language, or maybe there must be much more to it than what culture tells us. So Ramakrishna says he cannot disbelieve it, but he doesn't say reincarnation is true without fail. And I think this shows that he truly was an enlightened being because he was speaking to the reality, not the culture. And he understood that a large part of our narratives of past lives is influenced by culture. So again, very interesting. In non-denominational Protestant Christianity, the mainstream religion in modern-day America, we see our concept of a soul defined by our cultural values of manifest destiny and individualism. So, we believe that we all have an individual soul. This individual soul is the immortal part of ourselves that is born into us. It's either saved or not saved. We don't know where it comes from, whether a fetus has a soul or if the soul comes into the baby after the mother gives birth. Some people speculate that God gives us a soul, and maybe atheists don't have souls. The prevailing idea is that our mortal body and our soul are two separate things. Our soul is married to our cultural value of individualism. So we think of the soul as having special attributes, such as Carrie Smith is a creative soul. She does so many creative projects. And this idea of Carrie Smith is eternal, everlasting, individual, and when Carrie Smith dies, she will go to heaven, remaining exactly the same person as she was in life. We might say, similarly, that John is such a kind soul. So we think of the soul as being the mark of individuality within a person that makes us separate, unique, and special. It justifies our sense of personal destiny. It allows us to believe that we were put on this earth to get a degree in secondary education and teach children English. It makes the laborer seek to fulfill his role in a capitalist society, which is to say, your identity is your job, your skills, your specific usefulness to the labor system, and these special talents and qualities that are uniquely who you are. And that is your soul. And because you are saved, your soul is eternal, and after death, you will go to heaven, which is a very nice place. And this is culture. In Buddhism, the Buddha taught against the existence of a soul. And this can be quite at odds with the Christian emphasis of a soul, but very appealing to people in the West who might be seeking an alternative spiritual practice to monism. However, there is debate in Buddhism about whether or not the term anatta, or anatman, has been correctly translated. Remember that in Hinduism, atman is our term for soul or self. So anatman or anatta is the ancient Pali language means no soul. Or maybe it means not soul. We aren't 100% sure. Again, we have to think of culture. Pali is a dead language that's no longer spoken, and at this point, these ideas from the Buddha are thousands of years old. So this disagreement over the translation of anatta and other Buddhist concepts has led to dozens of Buddhist schools branching off in different parts of the world. So when people say, I practice Buddhism, understand it's fairly loosely organized around a few central core concepts and practices, but in truth, it is an extremely diverse practice that has been adapted to many different cultures across history. Buddhism does not believe in a soul, but it sometimes believes in a self or an immortal essence, quote unquote, but sometimes it doesn't. Buddhism does not have a central canon such as the Bible, and what is called the Pali Canon has around 50 books. I say around 50 books because the canon is different depending on the specific school of Buddhist practice, the country of origin, the translation, etc. So in either case, that's a lot of books. So, we can't know with 100% certainty what the Buddha taught about the soul, but our best guess is that it could be the Buddha taught there was no individual soul. It could also be that the Buddha tried to encourage people to detach from impermanent traits that are anatta, or not soul, and cleave themselves to the immortal essence within. If that is the case, the Buddha sort of taught of a soul, or at least the idea of having a sort of immortal, eternal essence that is beyond change or impermanence. But for the sake of mental gymnastics, let's just consider that anatta means no soul exists. And there is no immortal essence beyond this impermanent reality. Therefore, everything in the world is impermanent, and underneath it all is a sort of emptiness, and everything comes from this absolute void. which is a fascinating concept to wrap our mind around, especially if we are raised in a Christian family. And this idea of a void can be a little confusing, especially that emptiness is full of potential reality. It seems to completely contradict itself. But personally, I was raised in an atheist family, and so my experience is that most Western atheists actually believe this way by default. They might not call it a void, but there is sort of this concept of this emptiness behind reality, sort of within atheism. So we reject any religious or mystical concept about the nature of life and defer to science alone to explain those things. The way I was raised, I was taught that when we die, we sort of just go poof and become, well, nothing. We return to this sort of emptiness. And I remember being a child of around 10 or 11 years old, really wrestling with this concept that I would die and become nothing at all. And it really raises the question, if I am to become nothing after death, then what am I now? Do I even exist? What in me is real? If I can just become nothing, then how am I here now? And this is the gift of atheism. And if we follow that question all the way down to its root, which we can do if we are very brave, we might strike on something within us that is far greater than the concept of a soul or any concept found in mere religion. And so maybe this is what the Buddha was talking about. But let's continue with our exploration. So, continuing with this idea of a soul, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word nephesh is often translated as soul in the English Bible. However, the concept of a soul in America is different from this word nephesh in the Old Testament, which is really used to indicate a whole person, including their body. For example, in the Torah, a murderer is called a nephesh slayer, and a kidnapper is called a nephesh thief. On the first pages of the Bible, both humans and animals are called a living nephesh. And if the life breath has left a human or an animal, the nephesh remains. It's just called a dead nephesh, that is, a corpse. So in the Hebrew Bible, which is Judaism, people don't have a nephesh, rather they are a nephesh, a living, breathing, physical being. And to love God with all of your nephesh is to devote all of your physical existence to the Creator. It's about offering your entire being with all of its capabilities and limitations in the effort to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the Hebrew word for soul. In some cultures, those who practice animism, such as Shinto, believe that everything has its own soul or life energy, which is this concept of chi or mana. This idea is also found in shamanism. In other ancient traditions, the soul is not just a vital force, but believed to have different parts to it. According to New World Encyclopedia, I quote, "Several ancient cultures, such as the Egyptians and the Chinese, posited that individual beings had different elements in their soul. For instance, Egyptian mythology taught that an individual was made up of various elements, some physical and some spiritual. The Ren, name, the Ba, personality, the Ka, vital spark, the Shut, shadow, and the Jib, heart. Chinese tradition suggests that every individual has two types of soul called Hun and Po. Taoism considers there are 10 elements to the soul, 3 Hun and 7 Po. So as we can see, the concept of the soul is not simple. It is often defined by our culture and specific to our spiritual tradition. And so, if we can learn anything about the understanding of the concept of a soul, it's that we should retain a broad perspective and not become too attached to any one idea. Our belief in a soul touches upon the heart of our nature, and it is highly personal, and it should always be respected. Now for a bit of modern psychology. It can be argued that what is considered the soul is actually consciousness itself. And the nature of consciousness is not just individual, it is universal, meaning consciousness is not just generated by the brain, necessarily, but perhaps it is quantum in nature. One thing is certain, if a soul does exist, then the only sure answer we can know lies within us. My personal comprehension of the soul comes from a vision that I had while deep in meditation. And during this vision, I imagined myself sitting at the base of a pine tree. As my meditation deepened, I found myself sinking downward into the ground until I felt comfortably embraced by the roots of this tree. I felt like I could sleep there forever in the earth. Then suddenly, I found myself at a hidden chamber at the heart of the tree. It was flooded with light. My father, who had recently passed away, was within this chamber, and I felt his presence suddenly manifest next to me. I couldn't see him, but I knew him to be there. I could feel his presence standing there next to me. Then, with an indescribable sort of jolt, I felt our souls become one. And then I felt the Spirit of God join with us, and we became one with God. But then we sailed upward as the tree exploded around us, becoming a massive redwood tree, growing up and up and up. And as the tree grew, I felt thousands of souls, all combining as one great vital force of life, a vast ocean of consciousness. And when I came out of this vision, I was changed. I could feel my Father was still with me, and He was inside of my heart. He was in me, and I was in Him. And of course, God is always present within all things. He is within us, and we are within Him too. And so, just with this bit of insight, my own comprehension of the soul, as bestowed upon me by this experience, is that there is actually no individual soul. And although I compare the soul to a seed sometimes on this podcast when I discuss the tree of life and the journey of the soul, and sometimes I refer to the Atman, the concept of an individual soul might not actually be the best way to understand the nature of reality at all. Just as my Father and I combined as one and then became one with the tree of life, so I am in you and you are in me, and there really is no distance between us. So is there an individual soul? You can believe in one, and I don't think it will harm you. But my understanding through this experience is that all souls are connected as one vital life and being. Coming into this realization of unity is moving through various stages of consciousness and self-awareness. So this is the idea of non-dualism or cosmic consciousness. God is in us and we are in God. I am in you and you are in me. All things are one. So to answer this question, does a soul exist? I believe the soul can be understood as the self, the I am, and the true nature of the I am is oneness with all life. And this is why I say we are all one in the tree of life, which makes my salvation your salvation, and my enlightenment your enlightenment, and my liberation your liberation. We are the ocean.